It's been a great day so far. I've really enjoyed all the connections, the interconnections in each presentation. It's fascinating. So, on a day off from performing in New York, I visited the Walt Whitman Birthplace Museum at Long Island. The first thing I saw on entering was a portrait of Fanny Wright, prominently placed on the wall between Whitman's parents. Such was her seminal influence on the great poet. Whitman recognized in Fanny Wright a fellow trailblazer. I first became aware of Wright in Barbara Taylor's book, Eve and the New Jerusalem, a fascinating study of women who followed the utopian socialist Robert Owen and forged the links between feminism and socialism. Born in Dundee in 1795, Fanny was a writer, orator, feminist, abolitionist, a champion of workers and women's rights, a fearless critic of the banks and religious institutions. She saw marriage as a form of female slavery. She campaigned for birth control, divorce, and property rights denied to married women. She had a play produced on Broadway, and thousands flocked to her lectures in America. Eventually, the American government perceived her as a threat and would throw her out of the lecture halls, but she just carried on in the street. She was greatly admired by Mary Shelley, who kept a lock of her hair. Yet she was forgotten in her own lifetime and is now almost unknown. The year after I returned from New York, I was filming in Shetland. I've always wanted to visit the Broch of Musa there, one of several ancient Iron Age tower structures unique to Scotland, and this one still relatively intact. The Isle of Musa is tantalizingly close to mainland Shetland. You can see it from the main road. I tried to find a boatman to take me there, but it was past the tourist season and the weather stormy, no boats available. So instead, I went to Lerwick's Shetland Museum. There I discovered a young woman. Like the Broch of Musa, she was thousands of years old, and although I was looking at her reconstructed head, she seemed more alive than anyone I'd met in a long time. I felt she could have been my daughter. Same color of eyes and hair, same ski slope nose. Who was she? What language did she speak? Why did she die so young? Radiocarbon dating showed that she was between 17 and 27 when she died. She looked so contemporary. Does history really separate us? Or does it reveal how much we have in common? A poem was brewing. And this is the first poem from Quines. And it's in my voice. There are only two poems in the whole book that are in my voice, the first and the last. Head of a Young Woman, Shetland Museum. I press my brow to cold glass, two women, head to head. Your face tilts like a ship's prow, challenging the wind. Morning sky over the North Sea in your salt-washed cheeks and eager blue-green eyes. Your hair falls like mine from a centre parting, though holds no trace of grey in its peaked brown sweep. 5,000 years between us, and yet not a moment, it seems. Recognition, like that spark you'd know how to strike from stone. Thought tugs at your mouth's harbour, a half smile about to slip its mooring into laughter. Your skull lies beside you, mute echo, shell white in spotlit stillness, every curve and crevice mapped by expert minds. Your mask, their exquisite calculation, more real to me than any excavated bone. Did you sleep, wake, love and weep in the dark air of honeycomb chambers built by shores I've only glimpsed from plane and car, my stay too short and anyway my timing out of season? I want to know you, unknown woman, walk with you the cliffs at Silwick, tread the paths of Scalloway, hear your language beat the air again with skua, scart and Arctic tern, learn your life, those days that stretched behind your step, and though you couldn't guess their end would come too soon, gave you such a fearless gaze of hope. So that's the first poem. And I began to wonder whether this poem could be the beginning of something, a collection, perhaps giving voice to Scottish women through the ages, including this unknown woman from Shetland, and also maybe Fanny Wright. I started ordering books. The ones I needed were usually out of print, which says something about how these women have fallen into neglect. Many of them were surprisingly contemporary in their sensibilities and observations. In her memoirs, Mary Somerville, a major international figure of science born in 1780, who predicted the discovery of Neptune and for whom the term scientist was coined, reflects on environmental issues. Returning to her birthplace in the Scottish borders, Mary writes about the polluted state of the River Jed, which she describes as being invaded by manufactories. There is a perpetual war, she writes, between civilization and nature. And in her 90s, Somerville expresses her frustration about women's place in British society, where, unlike in France, women can't attend university at that time. In Britain, Somerville had no alternative but to be self-taught. When the First World War broke out, France delivered for women again, this time for the Scottish doctor Elsie Ingalls. The French government accepted her inspired offer of setting up the Scottish Women's Hospitals, the first all-women mobile hospital unit. The British government's War Office had turned down Elsie's offer, saying, "Good lady, go home and sit still." The Scottish Women's Hospitals soon expanded from France to the Balkans, and Elsie was the first woman to be awarded the Serbian Order of the White Eagle. She's known to the Serbs as our mother from Scotland. Another remarkable woman who received the same award for service with the Scottish Women's Hospitals was psychiatrist Isabel Emsley Hutton. In her vivid autobiography, Memories of a Doctor in War and Peace, she laments the devastating effects of the infamous marriage bar, a common practice which prevented women from working in their chosen professions after they'd married, excluding them from developing their skills and from the network of professional life, their careers losing momentum. One notable case was the artist Dorothy Johnson, who taught at Edinburgh College of Art until she married in 1924 and was forced to resign due to the marriage bar. My poem in tribute to her takes its title from one of her paintings, which you can find online. It's called Rest Time in the Life Class. And it depicts two of Johnson's students, Kay Price and Belle Kilgour, and includes a rare self-portrait of Johnson herself, murkily in the background. My poem is written in the voice of the model, who I think was called Poppy Lowe, a very popular model at the time, who sits at the center of Johnson's wonderful painting, Rest Time in the Life Class. I'm good at catnapping, resting from the pose. The murmur of learning drifts around me while I float off for a spell. But today, well, there's something in the air. The grapevine drops its fruit in my ear. Miss Johnson's to be wed. I pretend not to hear. A model's task, after all, is to be mute, a purveyor of mystery beyond the flesh. And in any case, Miss J's in the room. But this is history, or the end of it. A gloom descends. I raise my eyelids, an undetectable sliver. Belle's still adjusting my charcoal outline, while Kay, with an audible shiver, as if there's been a death, leans into her and whispers, "Can it be true?" Belle nods. Our thoughts converge on a straight line that can't be erased. The marriage bar. Another good woman consigned to the grave of wedlock. Her teaching days are done, and she won't be cycling along summer byways with paint box and canvas strapped to her back. Today is forever blue and grey, sighs Belle, and so this painting will be too. The marriage bar was finally lifted in Scotland in 1945, having done its work in relegating thousands of women to oblivion. But the culture of exclusion still continued. The women I celebrate in Quines represent a wide range of professions and social classes: singers, politicians, a fish gutter, queens, a dancer, a covenanter, a Jacobite, a marine engineer, a salt seller, social reformers, sportswomen. There's a whole football team, the first ever recorded international women's football match at Easter Road, Scotland 3, England 0. As well as writers such as Mary Brunton, Maud Salter, and Violet Jacob. Some were born in Scotland but made their mark abroad. Others, like the calligrapher Elsie Ingalls, a 16th century daughter of Huguenot refugees, and Eliza Juner, whose mother was a slave in Demerara, came from elsewhere and made Scotland their home. Immigration has played a positive part in our history and continues to do so today. The poems are all monologues in the voice of the subject or of someone or something related to her. Sometimes a woman is speaking, and at other times an inanimate object, a novel or a building. A poem for the writer, the non-fiction writer Nan Shepherd, is in the voice of a mountain, The Living Mountain, the title taken from her book of that name, addressing one of those new horrible non-biodegradable banknotes. Nan was the first woman to appear on a Royal Bank of Scotland banknote. The Living Mountain addresses a £5 banknote. You cavorted through my corries, capered about my braes, careened between my coiling clouds, played hide and seek on my plateau, glinted as you skipped across my ruffled secret loch. A butterfly, I thought, a silver-studded blue brought back from extinction, till the wind dropped, and you came to rest, snagged in moss campion, a plastic rectangle pulsing on the tail of a breeze. I dislike litter, especially your kind, polymer particles that issue in blizzards from careless markets, slip from pockets, won't perish in rain or melt with snow, though in your case, I'll make an exception because you bear her face. The woman who never rushed to my summits, but walked into me, took time to learn my every line, schist, gneiss, and granite, and heard my braided voice. You've brought her to light again, all I contain, nurture and sustain, held in her steady gaze. Only 2 poems are in my voice, the first and the last. In finding voices of these women, I've considered Scotland's 3 native languages, Gaelic, Scots, and English. In this next poem, I've invented the voice. I've imagined a granny speaking. It's the 1960s, a time of feminist awakening. Her granddaughter has come in from college, outraged by what she's just read in the press and journal. An obituary of Anna Buchan, who was a brilliant zoologist and geologist. Although the granny's voice is invented, every word in this poem is true. Anna Buchan's obituary. Yon woman was something else. I mean, the headline they printed in the paper yestreen when she'd pecht her last didn't gie us a clue. My granddaughter bringed in for the college. She's aye fu o' all kind of by-orner facts that leave me a hint, particular noo my mindin's tint. Apparently, says Susie, yon woman kent all about yerd and what's buried in it. Fossils, like the rigbane or fit dunt o' a bird, and all kind of gear, quaichs, ashets, bines fi lang syne. She howked out a wheen of them atween the railway line and Elgin Road. Mind where the old clay pits yins were warked? My brother's bits are still clarted with on. And there's naething she didn't ken about lamps, tillies, cruises, like I used to burn Ben. Yin frae Reed Clay, says Susie, for the Nile, thousands o' years syne, fair fan touche in style. In Story museums, she'd scans and leet ilka bit thing, nae matter whether talker o' pauper or king. And she kenned all thing about they mountains o' ice afore beasts were born, could look at a slice o' yerd and gie its name, date and place on our planet. She wasn't just a pretty face. And here's Susie's pint. She's beelin' our lass. This is the headline that came to pass abin her obituary. The braw woman, bless her, widow of an Elgin hairdresser. That is true. My own family is linguistically varied. My parents were from Lancashire, where my grandparents worked in the cotton mills. I was born and raised in the Scottish borders. I heard Scots spoken in the street and at the local schools I attended in Westlinton and Peebles High. I'm married to a Gael from the Isle of Skye, and I hear Gaelic every day in our home, but I don't speak it with any fluency. So where the voices in Quines are Gaelic, I've attempted to suggest the language with a hint of its syntax, incorporating some Gaelic words understandable within the English language context, I hope. Here's my poem in tribute to Margaret Faye Shaw, born in Pennsylvania, USA, 1903. She lived most of her long life in Scotland and died on the Isle of Canna, aged 101. She was a folklorist and musician. Her book, The Folklore and Folk Songs of South Uist, published in 1955, is significant in its field. Margaret learned Gaelic, living for almost 5 years with 2 native speakers, crofting sisters in South Uist, who, like many Gaels of their generation, were illiterate in their own language, having been denied education in Gaelic. My poem is in the voice of one of the crofting sisters. Mariandra gives thanks to Margaret Faye Shaw. She blew in like a wind with a dance in it, a load on her back, an Irish harp from New York, and a box with an eye, a graflex, she called it, that stretched its neck at you from folds black and heavy as a scarab. She learned our land, the sea, the sky, our names for different clouds, how to cut seaweed with a corran, to turn a ploch of peat with a spade, the time of year for every chore. And she listened to our words that we'd lost the writing and the reading of. The patience of her to learn our tongue, write down our tales and prayers, the one I gave her for the smooring of the fire, when Mary and her son and a white angel will watch all night at the door. She took our songs to her ear and made them skip from her fingers in lines along the page. The sound of our days she placed there with all her care. The look of us too, caught in that eye for ourselves and the world to see. And when she came with those pages made into a book, not one word wrong in the 4 corners of it, a golden ship sailing on that blue cover, bright as a summer sea, we cried to hold our lives in our hands. There are so many remarkable women I could have chosen to celebrate in Quines, as evidenced in the Biographical Dictionary of Scottish Women, an invaluable resource to me, published by Edinburgh University. My selection of 64 women can hardly be more than a snapshot, women who gathered skills, experience, and wisdom against great odds and were often excluded. The barrister and pacifist Crystal Macmillan, one of the organisers of the International Committee of Women for Permanent Peace, is a case in point. This committee was excluded from the official peace conference, All Men, convened at Versailles in 1919. Shocked by the terms of the treaty, the women drew up a resolution and sent a telegram to the members of the peace conference in Paris. And this is the telegram they sent. This International Congress of Women expresses its deep regret that the terms of peace proposed at Versailles should so seriously violate the principles upon which alone a just and lasting peace can be secured, and which the democracies of the world had come to accept. By guaranteeing the fruits of the secret treaties to the conquerors, The terms of peace tacitly sanction secret diplomacy, deny the principles of self-determination, recognize the rights of the victors to spoils of war, and create all over Europe discords and animosities which can only lead to future wars. The women of the ICWPP were not only excluded from playing what could have been an effective part in determining the course of history, their advice and warnings were ignored at the world's peril. We can't afford not to hear from those representing half the human race. The structure of my short story collection, Letting Go, a timeline of tales, echoes that of Quine's. A chronological approach. I'd written the stories over several years. Some had been published in various literary magazines and commissioned by BBC Radio 4. When I had almost enough for a collection, I began to think about how I could arrange them. I saw that they could be placed in a timeline beginning with the 19th century. The second story is set during the Second World War, but also refers back to the First World War. There's a story set in apartheid South Africa in the 1960s. And then there's another that is my husband's story that's in the 1980s, and another that moves between the 70s and the Brexit era, and one in the aftermath of COVID and several in between. The last one is set in an apocalyptic future, a kind of environmental disaster. As with Quine's, Letting Go represents a cross-section of society, people from many walks of life. There's a traveller, Polish chicken farm workers who were great friends of mine. They went back to Poland before Brexit, having suffered racism and felt that they weren't wanted. An architect, gardeners, homeless people, a daughter of the manse, and there's a theme of disability in a couple of stories. I'm the mother of a daughter with Down syndrome, and that's her artwork on the front of the book. It's in oil pastels. It's quite a big picture. And I thought it had the theme of letting go, the leaves letting go. At least half of the book is autobiographical. But unlike Quine's, not all the protagonists in Letting Go are female. There are a number of male characters in the book. Here's the opening of the first story. Graves. Sarah was perched on top of a ladder, leaning against the gallery, paintbrush in hand. The vestry door opened below, and an autumn gust swept into the quiet kirk, billowing her long skirts. A man entered in a cloud of leaves. "Hello?" she called down to him, flustered, trying to smooth the air from her petticoat without getting paint everywhere. He looked up at her. "Thought you were an angel there, missus." She observed him from her perch. He was broad-shouldered, but slim, with a towsy mass of black hair. His face, as their eyes met, had an open look about it, she thought, like a moorland road. "Can I help?" she asked. "I'm in hopes you can," he said, scanning the pews. She wrapped the paintbrush in a cloth, laid it on the gallery ledge, and with her back to him descended the ladder, one hand holding up her skirts to avoid tripping. She was sure his eyes were examining every inch of her exposed ankles and shins. "Never seen a lady up a ladder afore," he smiled, and offered his hand, which she didn't take as she stepped onto the floor from the last rung. "No, you're the gentry at ony rate." He surveyed the gallery, where she'd been highlighting the biblical texts in gold leaf. "Bonny woodwork, some skill, yon carving." "Thank you," she said, glad of the compliment. "What? You done it yoursel? All the vines, all the wee falderals o' thistles and wheat and... His words tailed off in amazement. "Not all by myself, my sister too." He took hold of her hands. She pulled away, but he held on with firmness and turned them over in his, as if appraising a set of priceless new tools. She was well into her 20s, but no man had ever touched her, let alone held her like this. His skin was dark as peat against hers and sent a shiver through her stomach. Fine fingers you have, missus, strang and canny, yet gentle wi' it, and your palms like tough white silk. Our father's a surgeon, she replied, extracting herself at last from his grip. So I've heard, and to the Queen hersel. Yes, people say we get it from him, the precision of the scalpel. Weel, wood is a kind of flesh, that's true. I work wi' willow, mysel, baskets. Ah, she said, you're a hawker. That's no why I'm here. Are you looking for someone then? I am. He seemed to be hinting she should know. His breath quickened. Well, she prompted. He pinned her with his eyes. For the man that killed my mother. Several languages are represented in Letting Go. 10 of the 12 stories are in English and 2 are in Scots. Snatches of Gaelic, Polish, Afrikaans and Italian also make an appearance. Getting the voice right and true is important to me. I write drama as well as poetry and prose, and probably because I'm also an actor, I get my characters talking to one another in my head, creating dialogue, hearing their voices. I do this when I'm out walking with my dog in the woods. I do a lot of writing internally before I type any of it up. There are only 3 stories in Letting Go that are in monologue first-person form, 1 in English and 2 in Scots. All the other 9 are in third person and in English. Where I chose Scots, it was because it just felt right for the characters. And monologue form was essential for them because I wanted to give them their own voice. They're women who have no agency. One who is bullied, almost catastrophically, by her family, who just won't listen to her. And the other literally has no voice. She's disabled and can't speak. So she's communicating her thoughts. In both these stories, the character is addressing the reader. And I'll read a bit from Skeleton Woman, which is the last story in the book, the one that's set in the future. And I quote at the beginning of it a poem, a section from a poem by Ian Crichton Smith. It's one of my favorite poems in the world. And it's called You're at the Bottom of My Mind. How Eikin Mention in Gaelic, and this is his translation. The reason I quote this is because this poem has always reminded me of the Inuit folktale Skeleton Woman, which inspired this story. It's like a kind of little tiny sketch of the Skeleton Woman story. And this is Ian's poem. You went astray among the mysterious foliage of the sea bottom in the green half-light without love. You are in the half-light, you in the half-light of your sleep, haunting the bottom of the sea without ceasing, and I hauling and hauling on the surface. That's just a moment of the poem. It's not the whole poem. So here's a little section from My Skeleton Woman, and at this point, she is a skeleton. It's a kind of magic realist story. She's a skeleton at the bottom of the sea on the ocean bed, and she's talking and thinking as skeletons do. I like sharks. They never bother you, fleet and sleek and strang, till the knives get them. And nicht mair you winna believe till you see the horror o' it. Oh, I've seen it on the telly lang syne, but it's no the same. The real thing's different altogether. The ocean starts to dreep wi' a dark rain o' cramoisy blood. Broken sharks wi' nae fins come streaming doon frae the licht onto the sea flare in a lifeless heap. I tell't mysel, sic a nichtmare couldn't be real, that I'd wake up and find mysel back hame on the sofa. I wonder what happened to Mum and Dad. Maybe they were saved. They couldn't swim, typical fishermen, my dad, and my mum wasn't much better, but they did their best for me. Used to take me to the swimming pool. I'd plouter about in the shallow end, them hodding me in the water to get my muscles relaxed. That's where I met him first, the lad I liked. At the pool. He couldn't speak neither. No way his voice on he roads, but he spoke with his horns. I'd been watching him dive in, swimming up and down. He was deaf, never turned his head when I grunted, hello. That's how I kenned he couldn't hear. I had to wait till he turned round, and then I smiled at him. He said, hello, with his horns, and I grunted back. He had a foreign look, Eastern, with almond eyes, high cheekbones, and bonny. She's an awful flirt, says my mother, I apologising for me. She doesn't even notice the laddie's deaf. Good job and all, because the next thing my dad says to me, and he doesn't bother to keep his voice down, he's yin of the Arabs. You're not to talk to him. He's no our type. The crap they come out with. Thank God the laddie couldn't hear. He just smiled, looked close into my een, real close, like he was seeing who I really am inside. And he said hello again, and then goodbye, sign language, same way the speech therapists used to before they gave up on me. I saw him every week after that at the pool. The eyes swam over to me and spoke with his horns and shining in. I thought about him all the time, lying at home on the sofa, especially when I watched the woman in the corner of the telly screen signing the news. I was sure he liked me. He kenned fine I wasn't a bairn. My breasts had grown, nice and full and round, and they looked good in my swimming costume, if you just looked at them and not my twisted back and withered legs. I mind once the laddie came up real close, and he pointed to his tap teeth, and then to mine. We both had a gap in the same place, right at the front. What a flirt, my mother said to him. Didn't he encourage her? I was supposed to go swimming on the day it happened, but my mother said I'd to miss it, with this being my time of the month. She'd just come in with a bag full of shopping she'd picked up on the way home from work. There was a low rumbling soon through the street. The lights went off, and Dad got up to have a look out the window. Water! He squeaked. Waves o' it! Fucking big waves o' it! The water crashed into the house like a muckle grey wall. I mind my mother, her een and mouth like 3 black holes stamp it into her white face. My father raxing out to her, and that was it. The sofa swept away under me. I was tumbling, twisting, choking, and then it all went dark. The other story, which is in first person, is in English, and it's slightly different because the character is addressing her dead child. I felt that the intimacy of the loss could be expressed this way, and a tension created while speaking in her head, this character, to her dead child. The mother is, without realizing it, building a relationship with the living child and letting go of the one she's lost. That's another story called Chromosomes and Chocolate. I love making connections. As the subtitle, A Timeline of Tales, suggests, the stories in Letting Go are all connected, sometimes very lightly, subliminally. This idea stemmed from the second story in the collection, Bella Day, in which I refer briefly to the beautiful wooden carving in St. Andrew's Church in the first story, in the village of West Linton, created by 2 women during the 19th century, highly unusual for women to be doing such work in those days. I've always been fascinated by these church carvers, women from my home village in the Pentland Hills, and though it's very hard to find out much about them, so often the case with women in history, their family background is extraordinary. So I thought I'd open the book with a story about these women, and then in the second story, which I wrote before the first, we'd meet characters living 100 years later in the same location, discovering their work. And then I thought I'd play with that idea, having cross-references throughout the book. Characters in different stories, different locations, decades apart, referring to or experiencing the same things. In the third story, for example, the mother sings the line, "And a black boy frae ont Nyanga," from Hamish Henderson's great song, "Freedom Come All Ye." When MacLean meets with friends in spring, burn all the roses and geens will turn to bloom. And the black boy frae ont Nyanga dings the fell gallows o' the burgers doon. And this is the same boy who appears in a powerful poem by the South Afrikaner poet Ingrid Jonker, the poem, "The Child Who Was Shot Dead by Soldiers in Nyanga." And I realized this is the same reference that Hamish Henderson is making. And this story, the South African story that I've written in the book, it's called Colour, is written from a child's point of view, my own, when our family moved to South Africa for 2 years in the 1960s. I and my brother and sister, I remember asking them, why did we go there? And they said, well, we were naive at the time, and we left. Yes, these connections that I'm interested in. Another connecting theme in these short stories is song. I'm a singer-songwriter. Song is central to my creativity and plays a big part in many people's lives. It's also a great part of Scottish literature. Sir Walter Scott, Lady Nairn, Robert Burns, James Hogg, Violet Jacob, and Marian Angus, for example. I thought it would be interesting and hopefully enjoyable for the reader to weave a thread of songs and verse through the stories. A song can immediately place you in a particular era, augmenting the idea of a timeline. The first story didn't work for me at all until I thought of bringing into it Sir Walter Scott's song Jock o' Hazel Dene, which has become one of our best loved folk songs. Why weep ye by the tide, lady? Why weep ye by the tide? I'll wad ye to my youngest son, and ye shall be his bride. And ye shall be his bride, lady, sae comely to be seen. But I shall lood the tears doon fall for Jock o' Hazel Dene. And once I thought of that song and how it could connect to the characters, the whole structure of the story revealed itself to me. It became a springboard for the protagonist, and I was able to rewrite the story to my satisfaction. Poetry, song, and short stories have a lot in common. They're both highly condensed forms. The research involved for writing quines was immense, but that isn't by any means always the case when I'm writing poetry. The act of writing a poem for me is often the capturing of a moment which holds a microcosm. Initially, I'm not necessarily fully aware of what that microcosm is. At first, it's just a hunch, but I discover its layers and meaning as I'm writing. I have to find a hook for a poem, a specific single idea which is supple enough to carry a chain of connections. I can't write a poem without that hook. I don't necessarily know, to begin with, where it's leading. It feels more like being a hunter on a scent. To my mind, the difference between a poem and a short story is that in a short story, something has to happen which makes the protagonist undergo a change. There's got to be a trajectory, an arc of some kind, which I discover as I'm writing. I prepare a lot for creating a short story before I get any words down. Think about the characters, their place in society, their terms of reference, their location, psychology, their voice. With a poem, you can't so easily take a character on a journey in quite the same way. There isn't time unless it's an epic poem like The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. But you can take the reader on a journey with a poem. With quines, where some of the poems are short stories in miniature, I had to work very hard at integrating the narratives into poetic form to avoid clunky exposition, finding ways of storytelling in images, and in some cases employing a meter or a rhyming structure which would allow a narrative to be driven forward in a way, for example, that the ballads do. Rhythm and a sense of music is very important to me. I come from a family of musicians, and for me, the sound of language is equally as important as the ideas being communicated, particularly in my poetry. The sound, I believe, can augment the meaning, and Peter Brook, the great theatre director, did a lot of work on this with his actors. I'll just be finishing in a minute. Character, societal situation, and place are more of a starting point when it comes to my short stories. Place is hugely important to me. I can't imagine a character without knowing where she or he is located geographically. Landscape, changing through time, is a connecting backdrop in most of the stories in Letting Go. Imagined characters from my native area, the Pentland Hills, going out into the world and meeting others from elsewhere. I try to avoid telling the reader what to think. As a writer, you have to respect all your characters and give each one a believable point of view, even if you don't agree with it. Chekhov always did that. He never patronizes his characters in his plays and short stories. He never intervenes with his own authorial voice. Also, perhaps because I'm a performer, I appreciate the value of entertainment, which isn't necessarily a superficial thing. A good story, well told, is entertaining in the sense of involving a reader or an audience. I like to juxtapose humor with seriousness, which is true to life, sometimes inconveniently. The most absurd comedy can happen in tragic circumstances, and I love that raw, sometimes surprising humanity of that. When I was training as an actor at RADA in London, the principal of the college was Hugh Crutwell, who was married to the fine actress Geraldine McEwen. He was a brilliant man, had been an English teacher, and I learned so much from him. Hugh would always come to watch the first dress rehearsal of any play we students were presenting. We called it the Crutwell Run, and it was absolutely terrifying. He was so incisive. Too much how and not enough what, he'd comment, meaning don't focus on irrelevant, indulgent externals, characters' mannerisms, etc. Tell the story. I've always remembered Hugh's wise exhortation, and it applies to writing too. Liz Lochhead wrote an excellent poem about this called Credo. I try just to tell the story with a lightsome touch. Let the story speak for itself. Thank you.